Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope you're as excited as I am about a new day at Waves. And Daniel, hi, welcome. Wonderful to have you with us.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Thank you, Daniel, for being here with us. I'm super happy and honored that you're here. And also...
I wish I could be there in person with you, maybe next year, but I'm glad I can be here from across the planet. And having heard that Nora and Dave, people I respect a lot, and friends are there, would have loved that.
Okay, but that's wonderful.
And I'm actually not in New York. I'm in New York time zone, but I'm in North Carolina in the beautiful mountains of the Blue Ridge.
Lovely. So let's jump into it. So you're one of the key figures in creating a discussion around the Metacrisis. Could you please share your thinking with us?
Yeah. It's tricky because I haven't got to hear everything that happened so far, and I don't have a clear sense of what everybody's existing frameworks and backgrounds are. But if people don't take a historical perspective regularly, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the idea that humans could pose a threat to the biosphere or to civilization is a very new concept in human history. That for the whole history of sapiens existing, a couple 100,000 years and 10,000 years of kind of written city type history, we could cause problems locally, and we have caused problems locally. We've even taken our problems on crusades, and we could overstrip the environment locally, which we have, but we couldn't actually threaten the habitability of the biosphere writ large. Our technology just wasn't powerful enough. Like Stone Age people or Bronze Age people can't overfish the entire ocean. They can't cause chemical pollution and cross planetary boundaries. They can't cause nuclear winter. They can't build AI that could possibly destroy everything, or synthetic biology. Those are all mediated by the very advanced technologies that are very new. And so until World War II and the creation of the nuclear bomb, the idea that we could make a couple fast steps and destroy the habitability of the world was not a thing, right? That really began with World War II and the bomb. And it's because we learned how to split the nucleus of an atom, right? Which was an amazing accomplishment of physics and engineering to be able to do this thing. It was not the result of our dumbness or our failures. It was the result of like radical success at achieving a goal, solving a problem that we wanted to solve that led to the possibility of the total annihilation of everything. And when we think about climate change, without industrial scale energy technology, we couldn't create climate change, right? And or any of the planetary boundary issues that we're facing. And so beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there was roughly 500 million people, right? For 200,000 or 300,000 years of sapient existence, we got to 500 million people. And then the introduction of oil and the Haber-Bosch mechanism and a couple other things, and we go from 500 million people to 8 billion people almost overnight. And we increase the resource consumption per capita, not just food, but what makes these lights and, et cetera, by about 100x per capita resource consumption, what it was around the time of the Industrial Revolution. So that's 16 times the population, 1600x the resource consumption being unrenewably taken out of the planet and turned into pollution and waste after a very, very short human use. Obviously, you don't get to do that forever, coupled to a financial system that requires exponentiation. Because there has to be more money in circulation next year than there is this year to keep up with interest. Because next year there has to be all the principal plus interest. So built into the most fundamental structures, not even having to do with derivatives and complex financial instruments and deregulation, just interest, forces an exponentiation of the monetary supply. And then all the other things speed that up. To not debase all the currencies, that requires more goods and services, which means an exponential embedded growth obligation on a finite planet with a linear materials economy that takes stuff from nature faster than it can be and turns into trash faster and pollution faster. There was an article published maybe 9 months ago on PFAS, the whole family of fluorinated surfactants crossing planetary boundaries, given that the EU and EPA safe thresholds were crossed in rainwater all around the world already, meaning rainwater in Finland and the USA and snowfall in Antarctica have levels of fluorinated surfactants that are carcinogens and other forms of health issue, biological disruptor to humans and others, are in the rainwater everywhere. And already at multiple times what the EPA or EU allowable levels are is one family of chemicals, right? So until the industrial tech, we didn't have the ability to damage the biosphere. Industrial tech gave us the ability to damage the biosphere, but kind of slowly through cumulative action, cumulative depletion, cumulative pollution. But we're right now at that place, having passed planetary boundaries everywhere and with points of irreversibility very close. And then, but that still wasn't a very fast breakdown of everything. Nuclear was the beginning of very fast breakdown. And so we built an entire world system following the war to make sure nobody ever used that weapon. And it was the first time in history that rather than developing a new piece of military tech where we would all race to deploy it to gain military advantage, we had to build an entire world system to make sure nobody used it. And I just want to mention that I'm sensitive and I'm keenly aware too that we're not talking about this in just general abstract academic topics when you are right on the border of Russia. And we are the Council of Atomic Scientists turning the clock to closer to midnight in terms of risk of nuclear war than we've ever been in all of history. And so, yeah, these are real, not academic topics. And so the answer to not using the bomb and to not have superpowers war, given that everyone who's there in Europe has studied European history and knows that the history was not having major powers not fight for very long, right? Major powers fought. Since empires, war has been a kind of defining aspect. So now how do you have major powers not fight was a historically unprecedented thing to do. And there was a bunch of historically unprecedented acts of global governance we did. There was a lot of globalization with the attempt to say, let's make these complex trade routes and complex supply chains so that we don't want to bomb the places that we depend on for supply, right? We depend on each other. The economic interdependence makes it to where we're motivated to not bomb each other. There's some truth to that. And let's increase, along with globalization, financialization that allows us to grow the GDP faster so that everybody can have more without taking each other's stuff. Because if the total pie isn't growing and someone wants to grow their pie, they have to take somebody else's. And so, but if everybody can be growing more, then they don't have to go into military conflict. But where does it come from? So it was a key part of that process was take shit from nature faster, which is a finite thing you can't do forever. Turn it into pollution faster, both the globalization and the exponentiation of finance. So the planetary boundaries are largely actually the result of all these environmental issues, the success of the World War II system for preventing World War III. But also in that time, we moved from having one country that had the bomb to two countries to now many. And we've also moved from one type of catastrophe weapon, which was the nuke, to now many types of catastrophe weapons. And when we look at the emergence of technologies like AI, like NVIDIA, nobody heard of like a few years ago. And right now, their market cap is like 10 times the GDP of your country. And when you look at the speed and growth and power of AI, do many of the top AI scientists in the world think that AI portends real global catastrophic risk? Totally. It's actually pretty unique in that it makes a lot of other global catastrophic risks worse. Nukes don't make better bioweapons and vice versa, but you can use AI to make better nukes and better bioweapons and better AI and optimize supply chains such that the increases in efficiency turn back into growing the market faster and et cetera. And unlike nuclear, the AI and the synthetic biotechnologies that have just as much disruptive capability as nukes can't be controlled because they don't require uranium and nation state level enrichment. They don't require exotic materials, and they can be made relatively easily and not monitored. So how do you how do you have mutually assured destruction or some kind of forced equilibrium in that world? So the polycrisis is the recognition, and it's a much more familiar term, and it's a good term, that climate change isn't the only issue we're facing. That is a global catastrophic issue. And that wealth inequality isn't the only issue, and that this particular type of pollution or overfishing or species extinction or biodiversity loss aren't, that there's all these issues, and that the post-war system is breaking down, and that we have multiple war fronts right now that we don't have adequate mechanisms to deal with that have real escalation possibilities. And we have these new types of technology, like synthetic bio, like AI, that have rapid development curves. It is unlike anything that we've ever had, rapid deployment curves. So the polycrisis is, there's not one crisis. The crises aren't local anymore, they're planetary. It doesn't mean there aren't local crises, but there are a lot of planetary crises. They're not just like a bummer, they are possibly threatening the whole story of the future at various levels. They're all, not only is there many of them, there keep being new ones every time we get a new piece of tech, but we're not really getting rid of the old ones. We didn't get rid of the legacy risks of war and et cetera. We're having more global catastrophic risks with higher probabilities. And then they cascade between each other, right? So climate change, before it venusifies the planet, starts causing extreme weather events that cause forced migration. Climate migration, the UN and other groups' estimated numbers for this are huge, like 1 billion people in the next decade and a half in forced migration, which then hit all the political tensions of nobody wants those people, but those people all don't want to die in massive heat waves without food peaceably. So then does that end up leading to war escalation and technological amplifiers? So when you take all the crises, that's a polycrisis perspective. When you take the cascades between them, that deepens that. But then when you start to look, why we use the term metacrisis often is that it is all that, but also that it's not just there are many issues, and it's not just that they have cascade dynamics, so we have to think about them together, but there are underlying dynamics driving all of them. And given that we have an increased number of them, an increased probability, there is some deeper level of analysis of why do we have all these? Why is it that literally no one in the world wants climate change? Yes, you might say like somebody in Russia is figuring out how to make a beneficial Arctic shipping path or something, but like literally nobody wants climate change. Nobody wants all the coral to die. Nobody wants species extinction, and nobody can stop it. Like, what is actually controlling our world when the features that are the most significant nobody wants and no one can stop? And so, yet it's easy to see that like underneath almost all the pollution and all the issues, it's like a choice-making process that externalizes some of the cost or risk outside of what's being considered. That's pretty universal across almost all the issues, is the idea of externalities, not just the economic externality of a cost, but any choice-making process, like a institution that says, I'm sorry, those aren't the metrics we're tasked with. In our jurisdiction only focuses on this. So it can benefit the thing it's tasked with while harming something else, right? So externalities and choice-making processes are underlying all the risks. Perverse incentives are underlying all the risks. One thing that I would like to bring up that I think is one of the generative dynamics that's particularly interesting, and it's related to the title of your conference, is that the way we solve problems most of the time makes worse problems. Climate change is the result of us having solved transportation problems, right? We solved the problem of that horse husbandry was difficult, and we had to clean up horse shit and, et cetera. And we wanted a horseless carriage, and that's what an internal combustion engine was. And the unintended consequence of having figured out that transportation problem is wars over oil spills, and venusifying the planet. And all the war risks are the result of us having solved problems of how to win a battle with a new technology, right? So the way we solve problems ends up causing worse problems. So this is a meeting for change makers. Not all change is good. Not all change that seems good through a narrow definition is good on longer time scales and in wider definitions. And so how do we really address problems in a way that is not going to cause worse problems, where there's some kind of spirit of a Hippocratic oath that says, first do no harm? How do I really think through that well? and know that this is authentic progress, because obviously all these problems we're facing now are the result of our progress, right? They're the result of us, and they're the result of us being good at stuff, not just bad at stuff, right? But there is some weird asymmetry that we can reverse engineer aspects of neural networks and make AIs that do exaflops per second. We can split the nucleus of an atom. We can do synthetic engineering and make artificial life, but we can't stop climate change, and we can't stop child sex trafficking, and we can't deal with wealth inequality. Like, what the fuck? So that's a brief overview of Metacrisis.
A few questions, two questions. One, if one really takes in what you're saying on all levels, and understanding deeply that the trajectories that we have now are not very good, or they are not good at all, it can be a bit overwhelming, feels dark. There might be a response of like distancing, this is doom and gloom, or we are, because change makers tend towards optimism, we want to have hope, there's this, we want to do things. So question one, why is it important to talk about this? Why is it important to address it? Second question, I hear you say that how we solve problems is broken. So we could say that our ways of innovating are not well addressing the Metacrisis. So how should we change how we go about change?
So the first question is, in the face of the overwhelm and difficulty and maybe lack of answers, why should we lean into that? Should we care?
Yes.
Because we don't want to be sociopaths. Because in my country, estimate coming out of the government agencies is something like 300,000 kids get sex trafficked across the southern border every year. Because what is happening to the kids, the young boys on both sides of the war in Russia and Ukraine, and in Gaza, and in et cetera. And you've all seen the pictures of what the inside of a factory farm is like. And if you turn away, you can feel better, but they can't get out. Okay? You can turn away and very quickly just buy extra things you don't need that have batteries that come from a cobalt mine run with child slave labor in the DRC. And when I first saw a factory farm, I wanted to kill myself because I didn't know how to stop it, but I also I was 9. I didn't want to be complicit with my species doing that. And I couldn't imagine just waking up and focusing on other things and being just stoked and happy while billions of sentient beings were being tortured, and that I'm just fine. But I realized that if I kill myself, none of those animals are better, and they can't get themselves out, and it's not their fault they're there. None of the kids can get better, and maybe I can do something. I didn't know how, but I had to. So death wasn't an option, and surviving and feeling good about my life in isolation of everything else wasn't an option.
So maybe
I don't think it can for anyone if you give yourself the time to actually care about what you care about.
Maybe, I think people here care, but maybe the question is, do we care enough to really rethink our strategies? Because we tend to jump into solutions. I know as myself as a change maker or as a person working with these issues, that you get comfortable in you think you're working on it, and then you might have this am I really doing the right thing? So maybe that's what I'm.
So UNEP was created in over 50 years ago, right? 52 years ago, to deal with climate change and planetary boundary type issues, realizing that no country could solve global environmental issues. We've known about climate change for a long time. Limits of Growth was published back then, right? We've known about ecological overshoot for a long time. And yet we have used more fossil fuels continuously throughout that entirety of that time. And if you look back at the recent years, the fossil fuel amount increases every year as nuclear increases, as solar increases, as wind increases, as ESG and blah, blah, blah happens. We're still using more fossil. We are not even slowing the rate of acceleration on it. And there's some really fundamental stuff that has to be addressed that if you don't think about the problem deeply enough to understand, then you'll do solutions that just don't matter, right? Rachel Carlson wrote Silent Spring way back then, and we use more pesticides every year. Plus, they don't break down when they go into the environment quickly. So so you have an exponential curve on top of a cumulative curve. And so when you realize, and we've had so many treaties about peace, but we have more destructive capacity in more hands today than ever. And we continue to increase it every year. So if you think about that seriously, and you realize that all of those real serious risks to the world, and it's not just that there's risks in the future, it's that the dozens of species that humans made extinct today are extinct forever, and it's already too late. We already passed existential risk of it. And that's going to happen again tomorrow. Right? So like the catastrophic risk is rolling. We're already in that. And so if you really look at it, you're like, actually, there's a lot of things that if I go narrow, yes, we can read all the stats that Rosling and Pinker and others will show. And if you cherry pick your positive stats, you can get that. But for each of those positive things, when you look at the whole supply chain costs and the wars to be able to defend those supply chain costs and the everything to be able to produce those, like no Native American believes the progress story, right? No, like American descendants of slaves don't buy the progress story. They don't even buy the democracy story. They're like, how well would your democracy work without slaves that have done all the shit stuff that nobody wanted to do? And so if you look at the costs of the things we call success, like it was a success to make a horseless carriage, without which we wouldn't have climate change or wars, all the forced wars in the Middle East over oil or the oil spills or anything else. Think a little further down the road, right? Like, and one of the other important things is there's a story that we just couldn't possibly anticipate because it's too hard to anticipate in complex systems. Not really. Not really. That's a convenient story as a source of plausible deniability for the fact that we have all of the incentive to move forward quickly, privatize the gains, socialize the losses, and then pretend we couldn't have known. When in the early days, Zuckerberg was building Facebook to connect the world, there were people like Jaron Lanier and others telling him right then, hey, the nature of your ad model is going to destroy democracy and cause teen suicide and cause polarization. And they're like, shut up, we don't want to hear this. And then later said we couldn't have possibly known. And the same with the PFAS that we just found that was in the water everywhere, where Dow had to pay a bunch of money because it was found that they actually knew that it killed all of the lab rats. They released it anyways and suppressed all of the science. So, and when we don't know, it's because we don't try that hard to know, because first mover advantage, right? Like if I exaggerate the benefits to myself and the investors and the public, and I downplay the harms, I get first mover advantage. I get Metcalfe law. I get, all of those benefits. If I really look at the harms, I'm like, maybe I shouldn't do this. And so there is a set of systemic perverse incentives incenting us to move fast and break things, to be disruptive change agents, as opposed to say, do we even understand the fucking problem well enough to know, like, without understanding all the causes of the problem, how can you solve it and not just displace it? So if I know you told me that there is a spirit in Finland that is deeply excited about innovation and being able to innovate things that are important for the world and export some of those ideas to the world, to lead the world in some ways. And innovating on how we innovate such that the way we cause problems doesn't cause any new problems is something I would love to see as a national focus, right? That's something I would love to see. How do we make sure that if our technology is successful, or, if our technology is successful and it scales and proliferates, what other technologies does that give rise to? What industries does it put out of business? What supply chain effects, et cetera? Is that good? If not, let's really think through it. Let's factor the externalities a few steps out. Let's think through, when you were talking about polarization, and Nora probably talked about schismogenesis. If we're doing a campaign for something, but the way that we do it makes the opposition also upregulate, then we're advancing our movement and the counter movement at the same time, which just means we're escalating arms races, not actually healing the issue. So really think through. And sometimes why that's hard is because there are perverse financial incentives to, move fast, capture first mover advantage, et cetera. But there's also the being that cares wants to feel like they can do something and they're not just helpless, and wants to latch onto an idea, and particularly naively. And yet if you really look at the state of the world, you're the way we have been, all of our principles of success, how we know how to measure success and scale things, and because all our problems in the world are because we're really good at solving problems in narrow, dumb ways. Not because we're bad at it. We don't have nuclear bombs and AI because we're bad at technological solutions and problem solving. We have them because we're good at it, but we're good at defining problems in very narrow ways where you can solve that while externalizing harm to lots of areas. And the cumulative effect of all of that harm externalization will end humanity.
Thank you. I don't know what you're hearing, the audience, but I'm hearing that this could be an opportunity for us.
Yes.
Could we collectively innovate how we innovate? Could we start doing it in a different way?
Yes.
What kind of ingredients do you see here in the potential of Finland? Now we can. Yes. Now I think we're hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the general theme of being able to innovate on how we innovate, and that it's possible that even though Finland as a small country can't change the global supply chains and things like that itself, or the war dynamics, it could possibly export processes for how we do anything, how we go about assessing what a problem is, what is upstream from it, what the levels of cause are, and what various types of solutions could be, not just a tech solution, but a bundle of regulations and technologies and cultural and solution, various solutions that create a kind of ecology solutions, and be able to see, is this ecology of solutions adequate to the scope of the underlying causes, and will they cause other additional problems in the process? I think if we talk about innovating on innovation, there's just a couple of concepts I'd love to, it's a very deep topic for what does that actually look like from a design perspective. And there's a lot we could talk about. It's a thing that our organization is working on a lot, and be happy to share the material as well, to share a couple of concepts now. Most people are familiar with the concept of red teaming. It's something that occurred in cybersecurity and then in military applications, where you build a cybersecurity system and then you have some of your people be kind of white hat hackers and try to hack it, and so then you can see where the vulnerabilities are and strengthen it. This will happen where you have part of your military try to run a military drill to see where the security failures are. That's been now kind of widespread implemented by businesses in general to try to look at how a particular thing they want to achieve might fail. And in doing so, as an anticipatory exercise, can we make it less likely to fail? And the blue teaming is kind of the how do we make it succeed? And those serve each other. There's a concept that we felt was really critical to add, which is yellow teaming, which is if the project succeeds, what else might it harm as a result of its success? Which is very different than red teaming. Red teaming is very important, blue teaming is important. But when we look at, hey, this pesticide was solving, it's a technology to solve a problem of a particular kind of pest, which ends up giving rise to that type of approach rather than a regenerative agriculture approach or whatever, which leads to a lot more pesticides and fungicides and herbicides and et cetera, which leads to dead zones in the ocean and anthropogenic illness being the number one cause of illness, rocketing amounts of novel types of cancers and endocrine disorders and whatever that correspond to the pollution going into the environment. And so the ability to yell at him and say, if this succeeds and it scales, and both it itself and then the new ecosystem of incentives that get created by it existing, where does that produce a world we don't want? And how, by anticipating that up front, can we change the design, internalize the externalities as a design process? Now, of course, you want to be thinking through the lens of all the possible stakeholders, and you can't do that without talking to them. And so, how do we engage people who can think through how this thing might affect very different areas? So, for instance, if you're thinking about building AI, this is a very important topic on. One person was mentioning bad guys are going to use something, so the kind of good motivation has to race. There's a version of this that is totally true, and it's actually one of the things that I think is most important, and there's a version of this that's very risky. Not just risky, I think, problematic. The version that is true is wherever we can take technology that was built for a commercial purpose that might have harmed the environment or for a military purpose and repurpose it to something that is, comprehensively better for life or something like that, that's a good idea. Wherever there is a technology that is being applied for destructive purposes, looking at how to counter it, it's obviously a worthwhile thing. But so many of the problems in the world are the result of the thought of inescapable race dynamics. And if we don't get better at figuring out how to bind race dynamics, as opposed to the answer is always we must just win the race. Obviously, we have arms races on AI weapons right now. We have arms races on every kind of weapon that exists: directed energy weapons, multiple reentry units, hypersonic delivery, ICBMs, blah, 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 right? We have all of these. And then market type race dynamics on AI, on various types of biotech. And the race means you don't get time to think through the yellow teaming and get it right. You don't have time to think through how it might be harmful because you have to race to get there first, because if you don't, they're going to. But maybe not, right? Maybe you work on better international agreements and various kinds of agreements to try to bind the things. And so I'm not saying that that's never a valid logic, but it's a logic that we can jump to too quickly. In the same way we can jump to too quickly, here's a problem. We've defined the metrics that we're going to solve this problem in, and now all we're doing is iterating on a prototype that solves these metrics, even though it might end up affecting 1,000 other metrics where harm is being caused. So specifically, there's this concept called dual use that everybody knows, right? That you can make military tech that might do non-military stuff and vice versa. And it's tricky because if you make something that was not for a killing application, but it can be used for a killing application, that's a tricky thing. So let's say we're talking about commercial drones. Commercial drones are made for taking selfies, or for whatever, agriculture purposes. But can you buy a bunch of commercial drones, put swarming algorithms on them that were developed at MIT that you can get for free on GitHub, put homemade and expensive explosives on it and target infrastructure targets? Totally, right? So how do you do the regulation of something that was made for one purpose but can be used for other purposes? It's of course also true that if you're making something for a military purpose that also has a non-military purpose, it's way harder to control, because rather than just don't do the thing, we're racing to proliferate the capability that can do other things to the market. So with nukes, we really controlled who had nukes. We really tried to make it to where even nuclear energy didn't proliferate too fast. With AI, we're like, yeah, it could do the most risky stuff ever, but we're going to race as fast as we can to implement it in every single industry everywhere and scale it as fast as possible. Market sector, and then hope nothing bad happens. And so it's important to understand that this dual use issue is very important. And there's an omni use for things that are computational specifically. And AI happens to be unique here, where AI really can be used to solve 700 million protein folding combinations in a couple hours, as it did, right? Or to be able to, so can you make better bioweapons with it? Yes. Can you make better chem weapons with it? Yes. Can you make better military delivery vehicles of all kinds? Can you make deep fakes with it? Can you assess how to influence political campaigns with it? Can you assess how to make a run on the bank using deep fakes and et cetera, like all those things? So let's say you say we're going to make it and only use it for the good purposes, but you make the technology that wasn't available, that now has affordances that make it possible to do stuff. Now, every agent that has access to it can use it for their own purposes. So when you're bringing about a new technology that didn't exist, you're enabling people to do all the things they're motivated to do. And so oftentimes we'll develop it for one purpose inside of an ethical review board and whatever, but we're also lowering the energy threshold to do all kinds of things. And so that means all the things for which there is fiscal incentive, for which there is not adequate law and binding, and for which there is whatever kind of radical set of incentive. So when you think of that, you're not just thinking about, okay, so what is the yellow teaming? What is the risk of doing AI for this? It's what is the risk of proliferating the tech that now makes the omni-use capability for all of these things, right? So the idea of really comprehensively thinking through the risk landscapes and deciding, is this still a good idea or not? And if there are some really problematic things, how could we do the design differently? This is maybe, I can tell we're out of time. That's the first of a series of ideas I would offer in terms of what to deepen in how we innovate. Yeah, I'm actually a really big fan of studying where we are failing in association with where we think we are succeeding. And I just want to kind of advocate for that a little bit in the face of the solutions orientation. I think many people here probably know the thing of Donald Trump's pastor when he was a kid being the guy who wrote the book, The Power of Positive Thinking. And so you can hear Trump speaking in affirmation almost all the time, the greatest, the best, everything. So there's obviously some power in positive thinking. There's also some power in being able to see where we're not on track and going deep enough into why that we can actually get design solutions. So if we say, why is it that despite the awareness of limits of growth, despite UNEP, despite et cetera, we're continuing to use more fossil fuels? What would it take to actually not use, like what would it take to actually shift that fundamentally, but specifically, why have the totality of our approaches not so far? And what would it take to do something different than the types of things that coming out of rooms like this for the last decades have led to? Like a very deep analysis of the really different course. I think the topic of how do we innovate differently, it was not that many people that developed the philosophies that led to modernity and science that influenced the whole world, right? Like so when you're changing the thought where you can actually influence the world radically. And Finland is in this very neat place of having such an educated population that has already done such a good job with meeting the needs of its own population relative to so many places. And yet, obviously, we can't focus on a countrywide level when it comes to global issues in a time where things are defined by planetarity. But the thought, if we're not on the right track, despite the collective action of all of our institutions and all of our change-making processes, how could we approach change-making that would be adequate to the scope of the problems? Can we innovate on there? Can we figure some of those things out? And can we export them to the world? Might actually be something you could do.
Thank you. Let's leave all of us with that thought. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.